Can you hear me? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And in advance, I'll apologize for the voice, so hopefully it holds out for the rest of the session. So as Simran said, the topic is transformative strategies for modern compliance and risk function. And what we want to do is we want to make this conversational. So if there are questions, we don't necessarily have to hold them to the end. Certainly we want to get the panelists to give their opinions and their views, but I don't want to be so restrictive that we don't allow for questions. So first, let me introduce the folks. Immediately to my right is Anand Ariani. He is the head of regulatory change management for the Americas for Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. Next to him, excuse me, is Bianca Ford, vice president for global ethics and compliance programs for Otis Worldwide Corporation. And last but not least, Faisal Siddiqui, who's the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer for International Financial Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. So rather than me trying to introduce the panelists, I'll let them. They'll do a much better job than I probably could reading from a sheet. So let's start.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon. Like Kevin said, I head the regulatory change management, operations, and business program management for technical implementation at SMBC, and also a key stakeholder in the GRC transformation, as well as very interested in what AI can do for the bank. So that's my background, and we'll continue the panel discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Bianca Ford. As Kevin said, I'm the Vice President of Global Ethics and Compliance Programs at Otis Worldwide, also known as Otis Elevator Company. The escalators and elevators are all over this building. I was really happy to see that. Prior to joining Otis, I was a prosecutor in DC at U.S. Attorney's Office for about 5.5 years. Prior to that, I did some work in high-stakes litigation disputes at law firms in New York. So happy to be here with you today.
Good afternoon. My name is Faisal Siddiqui. I'm the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer at the International Finance Corporation, or IFC. We are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. When people hear the name World Bank, most of the times they think about the public sector side. So, for example, the government of Paraguay wants to build a toll road, and the World Bank gives a loan to the government in order to do that. That's not what we do. We are the private sector arm. We're like an investment bank with a development mission. So we invest directly in private sector projects all over emerging markets. Everything from infrastructure projects to private equity funds. We do about $50 billion worth of investments every year. We have offices in over 130 countries.
Great, thank you. So, Bianca, let me start with you, and this is really, the question is in the neighborhood of check the box. So, how can organizations, what approaches can they take to be more proactive and risk aware without appearing as if it's a check the box type of an exercise?
Sure, so in my current role, I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm sure that's the same for my peers here. Otis operates and provides services in 200 countries. That's a lot of varying risk, right? So it's something that is consistently on my mind. I'm constantly asking myself, how can my team create messaging that resonates, that influences behavior, that keeps us going on our path of continuous improvement? How can we select trainings, right, that actually matter and teach people that they take something away from? And we know that canned trainings don't do that. Neither do policies, right? Canned trainings, video trainings, policies are not going to direct what people do when things get hard, when there's risk in real time. What really impacts what they do is culture. So how can we ultimately do things that build the culture that we want to foster and maintain the culture that we've been growing without just doing these routine things that don't really have impact. So it really is all about impact. And there's a lot of really good data out there. There's a lot of really good benchmarking reports. I've read about how important it is to embed ethics metrics into HR decisions, right, like hiring and promotion. And there are lots of good resources out there, but I think it fundamentally comes down to knowing your organization. We are in very different types of organizations, right? I'm in the manufacturing/sales space, and my colleagues here are in the finance industry. What that looks like, what knowing your company and knowing your customer, right, looks like in their world is going to be very different from mine. So I have to think about what will resonate with the folks who I'm trying to speak with, and I have to tailor that message properly, whether it's training or whether it's something else. We have to leverage our resources. We have to think about the way that our ethics and compliance resources are deployed around the world. And when I talk to our sales colleagues, it's going to be very different from how I talk to our frontline colleagues who are installing and maintaining elevators on a day-to-day basis and climbing up 14, 30, 100 stories. If we're not prioritizing their safety, I'm never going to reach them on the ethics question, right, on the ethics issues. So you really have to think about who your company is, who your people are, and meet them where they are. And I think that's a really big and important part of maintaining a modern compliance program. In addition to storytelling, people love to hear the juicy stuff. So if there's a way that you can share that to be impactful, whether it's lessons learned, whether it's also at the same time rewarding ethical behavior, we love to share stories about colleagues who found themselves in difficult situations and have made the right choice. That's a really powerful tool. So it's really important the short answer to the question is a lot of things at the same time. That's how you maintain a modern compliance program.
So I have a follow-up question, but before I jump in with that, I'm going to let Faisal and give their view on the same topic.
Sure. So I'll approach it, kind of piggyback on what Bianca said, but maybe from a different perspective. So I spend a lot of time due diligencing potential investee companies in their compliance programs. And that can be large MNCs out of Switzerland, or it can be a small family-owned business in Rwanda. And there's a story. The great American poet Robert Frost. So he went to go give a speech once in a college, and he was sitting in front of the lecture hall, and the electrical equipment didn't work. So he's waiting and waiting and waiting, and then he finally gets up, he writes something on the board, and then he sits down. And at that time, he was considered the greatest American poet. And so what he wrote down is, the wisest words I've ever heard is, there's always something more to it. So what does that have to do with this? When I do diligence compliance programs, I think sometimes as compliance professionals, we kind of have a narrow view. I start out talking to regular folks about, what is it you like about your job? What do you not like? To get a sense of what are the values of the corporation and what is the corporate culture. Not the compliance culture, the corporate culture. Because, when you look at it from the 50,000-foot view, generally speaking, you don't see companies that have great corporate culture and terrible compliance controls, or vice versa. They've got an excellent compliance department and controls, but the rest of the company is a bit in shambles. So I find normally that what's happening, whatever's happening governance-wise with the rest of the corporation is happening with compliance as well.
Right. I don't have a story about Robert Frost, right? But I just want to leave piggybacking on the two aspects that they talked about. Like, I want to leave you with two things, right? So one is communication. That's essentially key, because we operate in silos, right? So that departments, be it even compliance and risk, right? They start transformation programs within their organization, but they do not take into account the interdependency that they have with other initiatives across the bank or across other departments, connecting, talking how information from one organization is going to benefit other organizations, right? So because of that, it becomes a check-the-box thing, because the regulators ask you to do something, or there is a new senior management initiative to do another thing, right? But people don't talk about the grand objective and how it impacts the various organizations and the interdependency that they have on each other to make it a success, right? So communication is the first thing, right? The second thing is driving the culture, right? That needs to happen from the top down, right? So there needs to be clear messaging saying that this is our approach, this is our target, but there should be constant communication in making sure that people are aligned with the grand goal, right? So those are the two things which was important like 20 years back, which was important 10 years back and which is important even now with all the new changes that are happening.
Good, good. So the follow-on question, I think you all started to answer it, but I'm curious to go a little bit deeper. Given all that, how do you drive adoption? How do you drive adoption to your compliance programs, to your ethics programs? And Anand, I think you started to hit on that with communication. So I want to throw that on the table, if you will, so we can dive a little bit deeper there.
I can start with that, right? So adoption, convincing people to do something which they have to buy into, right? And execute on the vision that either someone else in the organization has or the organization itself has is the most difficult thing, right? So I think I was hearing the panel that spoke first. I don't know which panel it was, but they were talking about coffee breaks and getting together with people, having those one-on-one conversations with people, right? Adoption needs to happen at multiple levels, right? So senior management will have to buy into the vision. They will have to convince the people who are doers of these tasks will have to be convinced that it needs to be done to benefit the organization, right? So I strongly believe that adoption and buying into a concept doesn't happen in a meeting or through emails, right? So it is those one-off conversations, bringing people to the table, understanding their challenges, and explaining to them how a change is going to benefit them is the best way to get buy-in from various stakeholders.
Beyond.
Yeah, I agree with the leadership piece. I think that middle management piece, that root in the middle, is a very difficult part to target. There's lots of research that shows that when you ask folks how they view the ethical principles of their leadership versus middle management, there's a significant gap there. And it's something that we really need to learn how to inspire that middle management group, I think, in order to influence buy-in, because folks on the ground, they're more influenced by their manager than they will be by a CEO. But I think another part of it is trust. You have to show that you're committed to the values that you say you are, that you are committed to accountability and treating everyone the same, regardless of how much money they bring in and what their position is. If an act or some type of conduct is inappropriate, it's inappropriate not just for one group or one person, but it's inappropriate for all. So that consistency matters, I think, in terms of attracting buy-in as well.
Yeah, I think it all, in various ways, I think we're talking about incentives, and a lot of compliance boils down to incentives, and I know we'll probably end up talking about that with some of the other topics as well. But when I'm dealing, for example, with companies in emerging markets, one of the things that may not have a culture of compliance, or maybe they don't have the sophistication in all the tools and the capacity for compliance. One of the things that we try to demonstrate to them is the business proposition of compliance. So, for example, how compliance can lead to more foreign direct investment, or it can lead to presenting a case that you are a responsible business partner, and so therefore, potentially bringing on more business partners. So, I always think about the audience, particularly the business folks that I'm talking to, and try to find what's the business case. How is this going to somehow, lead to, the bottom line, to their, helping them with their financial targets, to trying to increase the profitability for the business.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback on that. There's this great chart that I use often when I'm talking to colleagues, and it literally shows how everything is connected, right, in that value proposition piece. So we talk about employees from the retention and the hiring perspective, and how happy employees who are in a psychologically safe space are, that sentiment that they have, that pride for their company, that's communicated to the customer, right, as opposed to the opposite of that. That inspires customer trust, that inspires brand loyalty. And then that constant reduction of risk that the ethics and compliance space creates, that also inspires investor trust. Investors don't want drama, right? They want that in their movies, not in their investments. So by keeping us out of the press on silly things, right? Things that are really connected to a poor culture, there is a very quantifiable value to that we often speak about when we're talking about compliance and how it's all connected for our business teams.
Yeah, great point. So let's shift it a little bit. We're diving a little bit deeper. So Faiz, I'll turn to you. Organizations have limited resources. So how do you prioritize, how do you optimize, and really decide what it is you're going after as your stacked rank priorities?
There's two basic levels of that. There is the strategic level, and there's sort of the compliance level. And I think one of the things that we mentioned, so I'll talk about this a little bit from the human capital perspective, in terms of what can you do when you have constrained resources. And going back to incentives, there's a little bit of carrot and there's a little bit of stick. So I think in departments that have compliance departments that have constrained resources, what I've seen is trying to find positive ways to reinforce how adding to compliance can further their careers. So, for example, I've seen companies that will use typically the compliance champion type network, right? The problem with a lot of times is you see it without any kind of benefit for the person that's the champion. So if they're a business person, they've already got their busy day job. And if there's no incentive for them to do the compliance champion duties, then those kind of fall to the side. So I've seen companies that will, if they can add financial incentives, like bonuses, they will do that. But more often not, they look for recognition. So recognition with the CEO, or when it comes time for performance evaluations, that compliance champion role, particularly if you've got like a numeric system, gives you an advantage when it comes to reviews. Or sometimes it's even just about an opportunity to be have a development assignment with the compliance department, particularly for employees that have been there for a long time. So they try to look for different ways to give people an incentive to stand out, to get recognition, in some ways that will hopefully help their career, maybe not today, but in the future of the company when particularly financial resources are constrained. The stick that I've seen that tends to work, but you need buy-in for management, is putting compliance KPIs in business objectives for business units. And particularly if those are followed up by senior management, that can be a significant incentive for business units to toe the line when it comes to compliance.
So Bianca, thoughts?
Yeah, I guess on the optimizing resources piece, I was thinking about it a little differently. So from my perspective, with limited resources, you have to let data drive what you do, right? So you don't want to deploy resources and action in the places where you have the least amount of risk, where it might be the easiest to do it. You really want to think about where your highest risks are. So, I think about that. We do have that ethics and compliance officer system that you mentioned, and they are spread out around the world. We have about 100 plus of them operating around the globe, and we look at data to figure out where they need to be, where I need to be, where we want to have in-person, I don't like to use the word training, but like discussions and presentations where we can be engaging, where we can use scenarios, where we can use role play. And it's so interesting, the feedback that we get from those people. Love it. It's very different from just normal ethics and compliance training, which sometimes feels like a burden. You gotta sit down, log into the system, sit here for 45 minutes, scroll through some screens, and then do a multiple choice test. No one really enjoys that. Maybe 5% of the population does, but most people don't. So we really think about how to make things interesting and engaging, because what you see you forget, what you hear you might remember, but what you do you really keep with you, and it really makes a difference in influencing your behavior. So we really try in those in-person situations to be as experiential as we can.
The way I think about resourcing is primarily from an operations perspective, right? So one of the things that we heard I think it was yesterday or today, is about low code, no code, and how you would effectively use minimum customization to implement changes, right? So I think of a very similar concept when it comes to resources, right? So it's about low change, no change kind of concept, right? So what I mean by that is, especially if you look at risk and compliance departments within banks, right? It's riddled with redundancies, right? So there are so many of these processes, right? So you could talk about managing controls, inventories, taxonomies, hierarchies, whatever it is, right? Every team and every department has its own way of doing things, and if you're a global organization, you replicate it by the number of countries that you're in, right? So it is a resource drain from that perspective, right? So I think it is important, and GRC tools like MetricStream and others available in the market are able to start rationalizing your capabilities so that you're able to use the resources effectively, right? One of the other thing is when it comes to operations, it's important to build shared services across functions, right? So if you look at risk and control, for instance, like monitoring, testing, assessments, these are all shared capabilities that can be built. But the challenge with building these shared capabilities is the redundancies that exist, right? So I think as a first step to resource optimizations, I think organizations should look inward and make sure that they're able to normalize these redundancies so that they're able to build on it for a more efficient resource management approach.
Thanks. So it's almost like we practiced this, and I promise you, we didn't practice this. You started to talk about tailoring programs. So to start with you, how do you, given the complexities of a global organization, multiple regulators, multiple cultures, so on and so forth, how do you work on and how do you tailor your program to meet the needs of a very broad, very diverse, very dispersed organization?
So I manage regulatory change for SMBC, right? So should know something about what the regulators are expecting. So I think earlier, maybe even 5 years back, regulators in different regions were focused on things that were happening within their jurisdiction. There are a few of those areas where they would look for overlaps, but they were primarily looking for things that were happening within their regions, managing risks within their regions. But now I think what regulators are expecting out of compliance and risk areas is not how effectively they manage within their organization, but how they manage the enterprise risk and how they manage the risk globally, right? So some of the regulations that came out recently, be it related to cyber, I think I was talking with a group of people yesterday about DORA and NIS2 and how the US regulators are taking a leaf out of some of the European regulators, so on and so forth, right? So there is a lot of coordination that is happening across jurisdictions, across the regimes, and regulators are trying to develop a consistent approach to evaluating things that are very similar, right? So it is only fair for organizations also to start taking a global perspective on managing regulatory expectations, right? So I've seen a lot of supervisory exams that happen where the regulators come in and try to understand whether the way in which risk quantification is happening in one region is consistent with the way it is done in another region, what the methodologies are, so on and so forth. So again, a GRC program should not only look at something that is happening locally, but also try to derive consistency across groups and even at the global level.
Faisal, over to you.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of it from a little bit of what is it that that the systems don't pick up. So one of the things that I've noticed, and I don't want to sound like a Luddite here, but one of the things that I have noticed is how unbelievably important the context, particularly the cultural context, is understanding that and where you operate. Take one area of risk, for example, FCPA, corruption risk. In my travels visiting some of our various offices, understanding kind of how that risk is presented and how bribery or facilitation payments happen in different markets varies greatly. And so, you can track whatever you can have a system that that applies a US or UK regulatory standard across the board and adjust it for whatever regulations are in the particular jurisdiction you're in, and that's fine. But what it doesn't sort of pick up is that kind of human information gathering about how things actually work in reality. So sometimes there's a gap there, and I think systems are improving. But I think that's something that we have to be quite cognizant about when we think about how to develop controls.
Yeah, I think those are all great points, and we keep coming back to the culture of it all. I think that, understanding how it happens requires us to really invest in creating a space where people feel confident and comfortable speaking up. And that also looks different globally, right? There are parts of the world where speaking up is not necessarily natural because it's counterintuitive to say something bad about your supervisor or to raise your hand and create a problem, be seen as a troublemaker. So you have to think about those cultural dynamics too, because the reality is we can't train on every regulation. We can't, issue a press release every time some regulator in any part of the world does something. But if we teach people how to do the right thing and how to think about things and give them the framework within which to operate and help them understand our values, right, then we can count on them to tell us when something seems inconsistent with those values.
So you just hit on something. I'm going to flip one of the questions, because what you just said about you can't know every regulation, you can't know every requirement, and this goes to tech-enabled efficiency. And beyond this, since you're on the topic, what?
I didn't want to talk about this one, but go ahead.
All right, I'll put you on the spot, I'm sorry. So do you have an example of where you have done or could do something with technology to ease that process?
Yeah, for sure. We have a bunch of in-house built systems. I think when I talked about tailoring things to really recognize where your highest risks lie. So we have a lot of different systems where people can share information about different things. Sponsored travel is one of them. Gifts to third parties is another. Self-disclosing conflicts of interest, we just created a really great tool that's automated for that purpose. So the good thing about when you're able to use technology, you can, one, automate, but you can also see trends. So that helps us in significant ways. Because my job right now as VP of Global Programs, I spent the last several years of my career in different parts of different industries, different contexts, doing investigations to some degree or the other, even at Otis. And in my current role, investigations is now its own separate little tower. So I don't have them. I literally get to look at the data and figure out how do we stay on our path for continuous improvement? What do we want to stop, start, and continue? How do we continue to grow in the direction that we want, because we know that growing in an ethical way is consistent to our long-term sustainable growth. So, using that data to guide what we do has been really essential for me in my current role.
Great, thanks. So Anant, what are your thoughts there?
Well, when it comes to complying with regulatory expectations, I kind of agree with what was said before. It is impossible to eliminate the risk exposure, right? But technology definitely helps to minimize the risk exposure, right? So, we talked about various components, like we talked about quantification of risk, we talked about controls, right? So those are some of the things, especially with the advent of AI, right? So a lot of things have gotten improved over the last few years. So there is a lot of technology capability that is available that can take care of the basics, and the human-in-loop concept can look at the advanced aspects of how to comply with the contextual aspects of the regulatory expectations. So definitely technology is an enhancer when it comes to applications that we learn.
doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the only thing that I would add is one of the things that we have been looking at more recently is using sentiment analysis, particularly in our due diligence of third parties. So actually our E&S department has started a tool called Milena that uses that particularly. It was originally developed to monitor E&S compliance with respect to our portfolio companies, and is now really grown to where it's being used to look at due diligence, I think more prospectively. But I think for me it's quite helpful in the sense that if I'm looking at a company, it gives me a good overview before I have to go in and look more technically about what are the compliance controls or talking to people about the culture. So I think that's an area that I definitely see growing in sentiment analysis.
Okay. So the last topic I'll throw on the table before we open it up for any audience questions is, and this is not about technology, but in risk and compliance, do you see over the next 3 to 5 years any trends that should be either are or should be top of mind? So, Bianca, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think that something that I've seen happening more and more regularly is that regulators from the federal to the state level are creating their own whistleblower programs, and we see that these external outlets for reporting are getting more and more frequent. That SEC has one, and we know that financial crimes are some of the crimes that are mostly reported to the government before they're reported in-house. So it's becoming increasingly important for companies to create a space where your people will come to you before they go externally. So I think that that's something that is probably going to continue.
So Faisal, whatever over to you.
Yeah, I'll mention two things. One is the increasing complexity of sanctions compliance, economic sanctions compliance. And speaking from my personal experience working in this area, and legal disclaimers is all speaking in my personal capacity, the complexity of sanctions compliance, particularly in the last 2 years, has just exploded in a way that was not there previously. I mean, there were economic sanctions programs before, but to a level where it's so complex that it's causing serious operational risk issues. And quite honestly, I'm not sure how much regulators are thinking about the sanctions that are being issued.